Hello, this is Rabbi Abramson. Rosh Hashanah is coming. Although you probably didn't need me to tell you that Rosh Hashanah is coming, of course we know that the High Holy Days are now upon us. Holiday programming, learning opportunities such as this video related to the holidays, these are other reminders that the holiday season is coming. All over the world, people are busy with holiday preparations, preparing for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in synagogues, although, of course, they will be far different this year than in other years. All over the world, people are getting ready for Rosh Hashanah in their homes, even though there, too, the holidays will be quite different this year than most other years. But there's another reminder that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are approaching for almost a month since the beginning of the month of Elul, the last month of the Jewish year. We've been adding a wonderful psalm to our daily prayers. Morning and evening, we've recited Psalm 27, also known as Le David Ori, at the conclusion of our prayers. It's a wonderful psalm, really one of my favorite psalms. Here it is. Let's first take a quick cursory look at the psalm. A psalm of David. Adonai is my light and my deliverer. Whom shall I fear? Adonai is the stronghold of my life. Whom shall I dread? When evil people assail me to devour my flesh, it is they, my foes and my enemies, who stumble and fall. Should an army encamp against me, my heart would have no fear. Should war rise upon me, still I would be confident. One thing I ask of Adonai, this I seek, to dwell in the house of Adonai all the days of my life, to behold the beauty of Adonai, and to visit in God's sanctuary. God will shelter me in God's pavilion on an evil day. God will hide me in the protection of God's tent, raise me high upon a rock. Now I raise my head high over my enemies around me. I offer in God's tent with shouts of joy. I will sing and chant to Adonai. Hear, Adonai, my voice when I cry out. Be gracious to me. Answer me. It is you of whom my heart says, seek my face. It is your presence, Adonai, that I seek. Do not hide your face from me. Do not thrust aside your servant in anger. You have always been my help. Do not forsake me. Do not abandon me, O God, my deliverer. Though my father and mother abandon me, Adonai will gather me in. Show me your way, Adonai, and lead me on a straight path despite my watchful adversaries. Do not hand me over to the will of my foes, for false witnesses and unjust accusers have risen against me. If only I could believe that I would see Adonai's goodness in the land of the living. Place your hope in Adonai. Be strong and of good courage. Place your hope in Adonai. At first glance, this is an affirmation of faith. As the high holy days approach, we speak in confident terms about our faith in God. But as we'll see, it's much more complicated than that. As I said, we've been reciting this psalm twice a day for a month before Rosh Hashanah, and we'll continue to recite it throughout the High Holy Day season through the waning days of Sukkot. So what does Le David Ori have to do with the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, the High Holy Days? Well, there are a number of words and references in the psalm that we traditionally see as references to the autumn Jewish holidays. Here's one of those references. This is verse 6, Ve'ezbecha ba'oholo zivchei teruah. It's translated as, I offer in God's tent with shouts of joy. Teruah does mean a shout of joy, but you know what teruah really means. When we hear the word teruah, you know what really comes to mind. Teruah. It's one of the sounds of the shofar. Ve'ezbecha v'oholo zivchei teruah. I offer in God's tents with shouts of joy. That's not a bad translation, but it also suggests I offer in God's tents with sacrifices of teruah, blasts of the shofar. In any event, the sounds of the shofar are one of the central mitzvot of Rosh Hashanah, and so this is an oblique reference, perhaps, to Rosh Hashanah. Now let's go back to the first verse of the psalm. Adonai ori v'yish'i. Adonai is my light and my deliverer, or as it's translated here, Adonai is my light and my salvation. Well, what does that have to do with Rosh Hashanah? What does Ori, my light, have to do with the Jewish New Year? Well, the answer is clear, at least if you're familiar with Psalm 37, verse 6. V'hotzi cha'or tzidkecha, God will bring forth your righteousness like light, umishpatecha katzohorayim, and your judgment like noontime. When does our righteousness come forth like light? Well, hopefully on Rosh Hashanah, when we're beginning the serious process of teshuvah, the process of helping ourselves to become better people, helping ourselves to become more righteous. And so on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, God will bring forth our righteousness like light. And what about Yom Kippur? Are there any references to Yom Kippur in this psalm? Well, of course, there's at least one. Back to the first verse of the psalm, Adonai ori v'yish'i. Adonai is my light and my salvation. What does yish'i, my salvation, have to do with Yom Kippur? Well, the rabbis teach that yish'i, my salvation, is a reference to Yom Kippur because sheyoshi'enu v'yimchol lanu al kol avonotenu. God will save us and pardon all of our iniquities. Yom Kippur is the day on which we seek and hopefully receive forgiveness from God, the day on which God saves us by pardoning our iniquities. And so, Adonai ori v'yish'i, Adonai is my light and my salvation. That, the rabbis say, is an oblique reference to Yom Kippur. But I mentioned that we recite LeDavid Ori through Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and even into most of the days of Sukkot. Is there a reference to Sukkot in this psalm? Well, of course there is. Here it is, verse 5. Ki yitzpeneni b'Sukkot b'yom ra'ah. God will shelter me in God's pavilion on an evil day. But when we see the word Sukkot or Sukkah, of course we think of the booth, the Sukkah, that we build before the holiday of Sukkot, in which we celebrate the holiday of Sukkot throughout the week of Sukkot. And so, Ki yitzpeneni b'Sukkot b'yom ra'ah, God will shelter me in God's pavilion on an evil day, or God will shelter me in God's Sukkah on an evil day. A reference to Sukkot for a psalm that we recite liturgically through most of the days of Sukkot. So we have references to Rosh Hashanah, to Yom Kippur, to Sukkot in this psalm, but I mentioned that we've been reciting it for a month before Rosh Hashanah. Throughout the month of Elul, we recite LeDavid Ori. Here's a phrase from verse 13, Lulei ha'emanti, which will translate, at least for the moment, as mine is the faith. What does that have to do with the month of Elul? Well, if you take the four letters of the word Lulei, Lamed Vav Lamed Aleph, and you reverse them, Aleph Lamed Vav Lamed, Lulei turns into Elul, the name of the last month of the Jewish calendar. And so, Lulei, the first word of one of the last verses of the psalm, also is understood as an oblique reference to the month of Elul. Well, there you have it. References to the month of Elul, to Rosh Hashanah, to Yom Kippur, and to Sukkot in this psalm that we recite from the beginning of Elul through the waning days of Sukkot. But there are other high holiday themes that we find in this psalm. Here's one, the beautiful verse 4. Achat sha'alti me'et Adonai, one thing I ask of Adonai, otah avakesh This I seek, Shivti beveit Adonai kol yemei chayai, to dwell in the house of Adonai all the days of my life. There are different melodies to this psalm. There's one particular Freilich melody that I probably heard at every frum wedding that I attended through the 1970s and 80s and maybe even beyond. There are other melodies, including this one. Achat sha'alti me'et Hashem ota avakesh. Achat sha'alti me'et Hashem ota avakesh. Shivti beveit Hashem kol yemei chayai, lachazot benoam Hashem, ulvaker beheichalo, lachazot benoam Hashem, ulvaker beheichalo. Achat sha'alti me'et Hashem ota avakesh. Achat sha'alti me'et Hashem ota avakesh. Isn't that a beautiful melody? It really captures the poignancy of this verse, the yearning to be in God's presence. Here's another one, verse 7. Shema Adonai koli ekra. Hear, Adonai, my voice when I cry out. V'choneni va'aneni. Be gracious to me. Answer me. Now this too is expressing a yearning for connection to God. In this case, a yearning for a sense that God hears us when we cry out to God. As a matter of fact, there is a bracha in our daily Amidah that begins with the phrase Shema Kolenu. And as a matter of fact, there is another passage in our High Holy Day prayers, a very, very poignant prayer that begins Shema Kolenu, hear our voice. And so the very poignant Shema Kolenu is perhaps alluded to in this verse. Shema Adonai koli ekra. Hear, Adonai, my voice when I cry out. But the verse itself is a little more poignant as well. Hear me, God, when I cry out to you. Please, God, be gracious to me. Answer me. Not so much theological confidence as theological yearning. That yearning becomes even more intense, more acute here in verse 9. Al taster panecha mimeni. Do not hide your face from me. Al tat ba'af avdecha. Do not thrust aside your servant in anger. Ezrati hayita. You've always been my help, God. Al titasheni v'al ta'azveni. Do not forsake me. Do not abandon me. And perhaps the most painful of all is this verse 10. Ki avi ve'imi azavuni, though my father and mother abandon me, v'Adonai ya'asfeni, Adonai, please gather me in. And finally, we return to verse 13, Lulei ha'amanti. I sort of fudged the translation a few moments ago. Lulei ha'amanti, if only I could believe, Lirot b'tuv Adonai be'eretz chayim, that I would see Adonai's goodness in the land of the living. If only I could believe. But look at the way this verse has been translated in numerous contemporary prayer books. Let's take a look at the evolution of the translations of this verse. The Silverman Prayer Book, published in the 1940s and in use in probably most conservative synagogues for about 40 years, renders this verse, "Yea, I have faith that I shall yet see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living." The Harlow Machzer from the early 1970s softens the translation slightly. "Mine is the faith that I surely will see the Lord's goodness in the land of the living." It's slightly less strong than saying, "Yea, I have faith." Mine is the faith. A little less emphatic. When we get to the Sim Shalom volumes that were published in 1998 and 2002, respectively, "Yet I have faith that I shall surely see Adonai's goodness in the land of the living." The translation is even more tentative, perhaps. And then finally, in the Lev Shalem Machzer that was published in 2010, and the Lev Shalem Siddur for Shabbat and festivals, published 6 years later, "If only I could believe that I would see Adonai's goodness in the land of the living." Whereas Silverman in the 40s and even Harlow in the 70s tried to see this verse mostly as an affirmation of faith, as the translation evolved over the years in these conservative prayer books, we see that the editors came to more fully embrace what I believe is the true meaning of this verse, not a statement that I surely have faith that I will see God's goodness, but a plaintive statement of doubt. If only I could believe that I would see Adonai's goodness in the land of the living. So what at first glance seemed to be a liturgical affirmation turns out, upon closer examination, to be sometimes an expression of faith and sometimes an expression of doubt. It seems as though there are two psalms here, one filled with confidence and faith, one tortured by doubt and struggle. Rabbi Reuven Hammer writes, "It seems that the total confidence of the first section was really a bluff, an attempt at denying the deep fears that the psalmist has. When one feels that God's face is hidden, one is deeply afraid and feels truly abandoned." Of course, it's not only contemporary rabbis and prayer book editors who understand the psalmist's despair. In Midrash Tehillim, Rabbi Yossi explains that this is what the psalmist was saying: "Ribono shel olam, master of the universe, yodea ani she'atid ata l'shalem sachar tov latzadikim la'atid lavo." I know that in the world to come you will give good reward to the righteous. Aval eni yodea imani beinechem. But I don't know whether I am among them. Yes, I have faith, God, that you will reward the righteous, but I don't know if I'm righteous enough to deserve your reward. I understand the point that Rabbi Yossi is making here, but I don't think that the psalmist is only doubting himself. I don't know if I'm worthy to receive the reward of the righteous. I think he's doubting God as well. And maybe that's what you and I find ourselves doing. Doubting God, struggling with God, especially this year. As we approach Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the season of taking stock of our lives, of taking stock of our relationship with God, many of us are doubting more and struggling more than before. The pandemic has taken so much from us. For some of us, losing loved ones to death from this terrible plague. But in addition, losing so much of what was part of our lives until 6 months ago. Contact with people, with community, with shul. The burdens and deprivations that have come to our lives are difficult to bear. And the challenge of faith in God is equally painful for many of us. Lulei he'amanti, the psalmist says, his voice trailing off at the end, if only I could believe. Lulei he'amanti, many of us find ourselves saying during these difficult times, if only I could believe. But Rabbi Hammer teaches us that this is not a simple psalm of confidence, but a masterful description of the state of mind of a desperate person seeking the strength needed to survive the perils of life, no matter how difficult the situation. Boy, that sounds like you and me these days, doesn't it? And Rabbi Hammer continues, this psalm presents us with the truth, which is that life is not easy, and that we are constantly presented with challenges both within and without. Therefore, we need to be constantly strengthening ourselves, not with false and superficial panaceas, but with the hope that trusting in God, we will find our way through the perils of life. Remember I mentioned the psalmist poignantly saying, Lule hamanti, if only I could believe, with his voice trailing off in the end? Listen to this comment from the commentary of Siddur Lev Shalem. It seems to simply trail off, and the speaker then hears an inner voice calling, Kaveh el Adonai, place your hope in Adonai. Wait a minute. How can we place our faith in God if we have such doubts? Well, that's the whole point. Jewish tradition teaches us neither to deny our struggles and pain, nor to wallow in them. And that's why Le David Ori is so instructive. It leads us through a journey of faith, then a journey of doubt, and finally toward a mature faith that can come from painful struggle. We can't get to the mature faith part, I think, without taking the difficult journey of faith. And Le David Ori pushes us along, guiding us in this journey. I see that I haven't used all of my allotted time, so I'd like to share with you part of a video that I prepared a couple weeks ago for Congregation Bethel in Bethesda. The topic of the video is Psalm 27, Le David Ori, but it concentrates on one particular section which my previous presentation didn't concentrate on, so that will supplement the presentation that I just completed. By the way, you will notice that it was edited by a professional web designer, and so there's music and other visual effects, a lot more professional than I would have been able to create on my own. Nevertheless, here are a few more reflections on Le David Ori. But one of the reasons that this psalm resonates so much in my soul, one of the reasons that I love this annual reunion with my old friend, is because of one verse in particular. Here's the verse as translated by the Jewish Publication Society. Ki avi ve'imi azavuni, though my father and mother abandoned me, v'Adonai ya'asfeni, the Lord will take me in. And here's the verse as translated in the Silverman Prayer Book, the prayer book that so many of us used from the time of its publication in the mid-1940s through the 1980s and beyond. In the Silverman Prayer Book, this verse is translated, even if my father and mother forsook me, the Lord would take me under his care. And later prayer book translations, including this one from Sim Shalom from the late 1990s, soften the translation slightly. Though my father and mother leave me, Adonai will care for me. This verse in this generally meaningful psalm is particularly meaningful to me because I sat Shiva for two parents during the month of Elul, once almost 2 years ago and once almost 16 years ago, both times during our twice-a-day recitation of this psalm. And as I recited the psalm during those Shiva Minyanim, this particular verse hit me in the face with unexpected intensity and meaning. Because I was discovering that although my parent had left me, God was taking care of me, just as the psalm promised. How was God taking care of me? Well, 16 years ago, for example, my parents' home was filled throughout the week of Shiva with family and friends, with familiar and unfamiliar faces, with community. And if I felt God's healing presence in those difficult days, it was because of the presence of family and community. And 14 years later, when I was again sitting Shiva during the month of Elul, the location was different and many of the faces were different, but the healing was the same. The community were doing their work, bringing God's healing power into the home of a bereaved family. And yes, I know that I'm talking to you in extraordinary times. I know that none of us has been to a normal Shiva Minyan in more than 5 months. I know that mourners these days are denied the consoling presence of community. And I know the communities are denied the opportunity to fulfill the mitzvah of Nichum Avelim, of comforting mourners in the usual way. Of course, so many of the usual ways of life and the usual ways of our Jewish lives are painfully disrupted in this terrible, terrible time. Shul isn't the same. Some of us participate in Zoom services on Shabbat, some on Shabbat and weekdays, some of us only on weekdays, and it's not the same. It's not the same as sitting next to this or that friend in Shul, or kibitzing at breakfast after Minyan, or catching up at Kiddush with people we haven't seen since last Shabbos. These days, we're all mourning the loss of a feeling of community, mourning the diminishment of so many aspects of our Jewish lives that are fundamentally tied to other people, to family, to community. And so we go to shul virtually, and it's not the same. But some of us are discovering that it's not nothing. The experience may be inherently inferior to a real shul experience, but it's not nothing. Gradually, some of us are learning to feel the presence of community, even through all those rectangles in a Zoom window. Gradually, we're learning to sense God's presence in our Zoom minyanim, in our virtual shul experience. And even if some days we feel as bereft as a child abandoned by his or her parents, there are other days that we begin to feel that God is taking care of us. It's not simple and it's not easy, but that's one of the challenges we face under normal circumstances, and all the more so under these abnormally challenging circumstances. To nurture, strengthen, and expand our relationship to Jewish tradition, and in so doing, to nurture, strengthen, and expand our connection to God. That's one of the central themes of the High Holy Days, and that's one of the lessons of my favorite psalm, Le David Ori. Well, as you see, I've been thinking about Psalm 27, Le David Ori, a lot. Not only because I've been reciting it regularly throughout this month of Elul, but perhaps for a variety of reasons. This year in particular, I found this psalm to be especially meaningful, and so I've been thinking a lot about it, learning a lot about it, and teaching a lot about it. I hope you find different aspects of this psalm to be meaningful as well, and I wish you a Shana Tova.